Major Sarah Chen walked into the briefing room at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan and felt the familiar weight of dozens of eyes watching her every move. The room fell quiet as conversations stopped mid-sentence. She had been through this routine hundreds of times before, but it never got easier. Being the only female pilot in an A-10 squadron meant living under a microscope, where every mistake was magnified and every success was dismissed as luck. She took her usual seat in the back corner and pulled out her mission notes. Around her, the other pilots resumed their conversations, but she could feel them stealing glances in her direction. They were talking about her again. They always talked about her. Captain Jake Morrison leaned back in his chair and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. He was one of those pilots who never missed a chance to remind everyone how long he had been flying combat missions. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never been proven wrong about anything important in his life. Morrison said that close air support was not a job for someone who might hesitate when the bullets started flying. He said it required a certain kind of aggressive mindset that came naturally to men, but had to be learned by women. He said the A-10 Thunderbolt was built for pilots who could make split-second decisions without worrying about consequences. The aircraft was nicknamed the Warthog because it was ugly and mean and designed to fly into situations that would make most people turn around and run. Sarah had heard these arguments so many times she could recite them from memory. The other pilots believed that flying close air support required a level of recklessness that women simply did not possess. They thought combat flying was about testosterone and aggression, and taking risks that only men would be willing to take. They looked at her small frame and quiet demeanor and assumed she would crack under pressure when soldiers on the ground were depending on her to save their lives. What they did not know was that Sarah had been taking risks and making life or death decisions since she was 12 years old. She had grown up on her family farm in Nebraska, where her father ran a crop dusting business. Every morning before school, she would help him load chemicals into their old biplane and watch him take off to spray fields across 3 counties. By the time she was old enough to reach the rudder pedals, he was teaching her to fly. Crop dusting was not like normal flying. It required skimming just a few feet above wheat fields and corn stalks at speeds that left no room for mistakes. Sarah learned to thread her aircraft between power lines and grain silos while maintaining precise altitude control that would impress test pilots. Her father taught her that flying low was not about being reckless. It was about being so skilled and so focused that you could operate safely in conditions that would terrify other pilots. When Sarah was 16, her father had a heart attack during a routine spraying mission. His aircraft went down in a field 5 miles from their house, and by the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. Sarah inherited the crop dusting business and spent the next 2 years flying missions that grown men with decades of experience found challenging. She learned to judge wind speed by watching wheat move and to navigate by reading the landscape below, instead of relying on instruments that could fail at the worst possible moment. The skills she developed during those years made her a natural fit for the A-10 when she joined the Air Force. The aircraft was designed to fly low and slow and to take punishment that would destroy other planes. It was built around a massive cannon that could destroy tanks in fortified positions, but only if the pilot was willing to get close enough to use it effectively. That meant flying at altitudes where enemy soldiers could hit you with small arms fire and where a single mistake could send you straight into the ground. Sarah understood something that many of her fellow pilots did not. Flying low was not about being brave or reckless. It was about having such complete control of your aircraft that you could operate safely in an environment where others saw only danger. She had spent years perfecting those skills, while most of her squadron mates were still in high school learning to drive cars. But the other pilots did not know about her background, and she had learned not to talk about it. Every time she mentioned growing up on a farm, they would smile and nod and then continue treating her like someone who needed to be protected from the harsh realities of combat flying. They assumed that farming was about driving tractors in straight lines and had no understanding of what it took to fly a crop duster through a thunderstorm or to spray a field surrounded by obstacles that could kill you if you made a single wrong turn. Major Williams stood up at the front of the room and called for attention. He was the squadron commander and had been flying A-10 since before Sarah was born. He had seen dozens of pilots come and go, and had developed strong opinions about who belonged in combat and who did not. He looked directly at Sarah as he spoke about the dangers of low altitude flying and the importance of following established procedures. Williams said that the A-10 community had developed its tactics and procedures over decades of combat experience. He said that pilots who tried to show off or prove points usually ended up getting themselves or others killed. He emphasized that there were minimum altitude restrictions for good reasons, and that pilots who ignored those restrictions were putting missions at risk. Sarah knew that Williams was talking about her even though he never mentioned her name. She had been pushing the boundaries of what the squadron considered acceptable flying, and some of the older pilots had complained about her techniques. They said she flew too low and took unnecessary risks that could inspire other pilots to attempt maneuvers beyond their skill level. The briefing continued with discussions of weather conditions and enemy activity in their area of operations. Sarah listened carefully and took notes, but her mind kept returning to the conversation she had overheard in the hallway before the meeting. Two pilots had been discussing whether women had the physical strength and mental toughness to handle close air support missions. In high-threat environments, they said that flying the A-10 in combat required dealing with intense stress and making decisions that could haunt you for the rest of your life. They questioned whether someone who had never been in a real fight could pull the trigger when it mattered most. They worried that hesitation or compassion could get ground troops killed when aggressive action was the only thing that would save lives. Sarah had never been in a fist fight, but she had made plenty of life and death decisions. Every time she took off in a crop duster loaded with dangerous chemicals, she was risking not just her own life, but the lives of anyone on the ground below. She had flown through weather conditions that grounded commercial airlines and had landed damaged aircraft in fields where a single mistake would have killed her instantly, but she knew that explaining her background would not change any minds. The other pilots had already decided what they thought about female combat pilots, and no amount of evidence was going to convince them otherwise. They would continue to watch her with skeptical eyes and wait for her to make a mistake that would prove their theories correct. What Sarah did not know was that very soon she would get a chance to show them exactly what she was capable of. A mission was coming that would require flying lower than anyone in the squadron thought possible. It would test every skill she had learned during those early morning flights over Nebraska wheat fields, and would force her to push the A-10 beyond what most pilots considered safe limits. When that moment came, she would have to prove that everything the doubters believed about female pilots was wrong. The alarm bell shattered the quiet of the early morning at exactly 3 o'clock. Sarah jolted awake in her bunk and immediately reached for her flight suit. Around her, the other pilots were doing the same thing. Emergency scrambles in the middle of the night usually meant that American soldiers somewhere were in serious trouble and needed help fast. Within minutes, the entire squadron was rushing toward the operations center, where Major Williams was already studying maps and radio transcripts. His face looked grim in the harsh fluorescent lighting. Sarah could tell from his expression that this was not going to be a routine mission. Williams pointed to a location on the map marked with a red circle. He explained that forward operating base Phoenix was under heavy attack from Taliban forces. The small outpost housed fewer than 50 American soldiers, but it controlled a strategic mountain pass that coalition forces needed to keep open. If the base fell, the enemy would control the entire valley and could cut off supply lines to 3 other bases. The situation had started 6 hours earlier, when Taliban fighters launched a coordinated assault from multiple directions. The base commander had called for immediate air support, but the first wave of fighter jets had been unable to help. The enemy had positioned themselves in a narrow canyon that provided natural protection from air attacks. The steep rocky walls made it almost impossible for fast-moving jets to get a clear shot at the targets. Captain Morrison raised his hand and asked about the terrain around the target area. Williams pulled up satellite photos that showed the problem clearly. The canyon was barely wide enough for an aircraft to fly through, and it twisted back and forth like a snake. Enemy fighters had set up positions along both walls where they could fire down at the base while remaining hidden from aircraft flying overhead. 3 different pilots had already attempted to provide close air support, but all had been forced to abort their missions. The canyon was simply too narrow, and the enemy positions too well protected. Each pilot reported the same thing. Flying low enough to engage the targets would require dropping below the canyon walls, where there would be no room to maneuver if something went wrong. Lieutenant Peterson was the most recent pilot to attempt the mission. He had 20 years of experience flying the A-10 and was considered one of the best in the squadron. But even he had been forced to turn back after taking heavy ground fire during his approach. He told Williams that the mission was impossible with current tactics and recommended calling in heavy bombers to level the entire canyon. Williams shook his head and explained that they could not use heavy bombs because the blast would likely collapse the canyon walls and bury the base they were trying to protect. The soldiers at Forward Operating Base Phoenix needed precise strikes against specific targets, not massive explosions that could kill everyone in the area. The radio crackled with another transmission from the base commander. His voice was strained, and Sarah could hear gunfire in the background. He reported that his perimeter was shrinking and his men were running low on ammunition. Without air support within the next 2 hours, he would have no choice but to order a fighting withdrawal. That would mean abandoning the strategic position and allowing the enemy to control the entire valley. Sarah had been studying the satellite photos while the other pilots discussed the failed missions. She noticed something that everyone else seemed to have missed. Running along the bottom of the canyon was what appeared to be a dry riverbed. The seasonal stream had carved a winding path through the rocky floor that followed the natural contours of the terrain. She traced the riverbed with her finger and realized it provided a potential flight path that would keep an aircraft below the sight lines of the enemy positions. If a pilot could follow that curved route at extremely low altitude, they might be able to approach the targets from an unexpected direction. The enemy fighters had positioned themselves to defend against attacks from above, but they probably had not considered the possibility of someone flying at ground level. Sarah raised her hand and pointed out the dry riverbed to Major Williams. She explained her theory about using it as a natural flight corridor that would allow an A-10 to get close enough to engage the targets effectively. Williams studied the photos for several minutes before shaking his head. He said the altitude required for such an approach would be far below minimum safe parameters for combat operations. Captain Morrison laughed and said that following a riverbed through a canyon would be like trying to thread a needle while riding a motorcycle. He pointed out that the A-10 was not designed for terrain following flight at such low altitudes. The aircraft was built to attack targets from medium altitude where pilots would have room to maneuver if they came under fire. Sarah argued that the A-10 was actually perfect for low-altitude flying because of its slow speed and excellent low-speed handling characteristics. She explained that crop dusters routinely flew at similar altitudes when spraying fields, and that the techniques were not as dangerous as they appeared if the pilot had proper training and experience. The other pilots exchanged glances, and Sarah could see the skepticism in their eyes. Morrison asked if she seriously thought she could fly an A-10 through a canyon at treetop level while enemy soldiers were shooting at her. He said that kind of flying required reflexes and aggression that took years to develop in combat situations. Williams interrupted the discussion and reminded everyone that they had soldiers in immediate danger who needed help. He said they could debate flying techniques later, but right now they needed to find a solution that would work. The base commander had made it clear that his situation was becoming desperate, and time was running out. Sarah stood up and looked directly at Williams. She told him that she had been flying at extremely low altitudes since she was 12 years old, and had more experience with terrain following flight than anyone else in the squadron. She said she understood the risks, but believed the mission was possible if executed properly. The room fell silent as everyone processed what she had just said. Peterson shook his head and reminded her that 3 experienced pilots had already tried and failed. He said the enemy fire was too intense, and the margin for error too small for anyone to succeed. Sarah acknowledged that the previous attempts had failed, but pointed out that all 3 pilots had used conventional attack profiles that the enemy was prepared to defend against. She argued that approaching from ground level would catch the Taliban fighters completely off guard because they would not expect anyone to be crazy enough to try such a dangerous flight path. Williams studied her face for a long moment before asking if she was volunteering for the mission. Sarah nodded and said she was confident she could succeed where the others had failed. She explained that her background in crop dusting had taught her to fly safely at altitudes that looked impossible to other pilots. Morrison stood up and said he thought sending Sarah on such a dangerous mission would be a mistake. He argued that if she failed, the soldiers at the base would have no chance of survival because there would be no time for another rescue attempt. He said the squadron could not afford to lose their only female pilot on a mission that was probably impossible. Sarah felt her anger rising but kept her voice steady as she responded. She told Morrison that gender had nothing to do with flying ability and that she was just as qualified as any other pilot in the squadron. She said she was not asking for special treatment, but simply for the chance to use her unique skills to save American lives. Williams raised his hand for silence and announced his decision. He said that Sarah would attempt the mission, but only after receiving detailed briefings on the target area and enemy positions. He emphasized that she would have complete authority to abort if conditions became too dangerous, and that no one would question her judgment. As the briefing broke up, Sarah began preparing for what would be the most challenging mission of her career. She knew that every pilot in the squadron would be watching to see if she could succeed where experienced male pilots had failed. But more importantly, she knew that 50 American soldiers were counting on her to prove that impossible missions were only impossible until someone figured out how to make them work. Sarah strapped herself into the cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt as the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon. The aircraft had been loaded with a full complement of 30mm cannon rounds and Maverick missiles. Every system had been checked, twice by the ground crew who knew this mission was different from anything they had supported before. She ran through her pre-flight checklist with methodical precision while her mind rehearsed the flight path she had memorized from the satellite photos. The dry riverbed twisted through the canyon like a serpent, and she would need to follow every curve perfectly while maintaining an altitude that would keep her below the enemy sightlines. There would be no room for error and no second chances if something went wrong. The tower cleared her for takeoff, and Sarah pushed the throttles forward. The twin engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and the heavily loaded aircraft began rolling down the runway. She had flown hundreds of combat missions, but none had required the precision and skill that this one would demand. As the A-10 lifted off, she could see other pilots standing outside the operations building watching her departure. The flight to the target area took 30 minutes, during which Sarah reviewed every detail of her planned approach. She studied the terrain features that would serve as navigation checkpoints and visualized exactly how she would need to position the aircraft for each phase of the attack. The techniques she had learned crop dusting would be essential, but she would be applying them in conditions far more dangerous than anything she had experienced over Nebraska wheat fields. As she approached the mountains surrounding the target canyon, Sarah could see smoke rising from forward operating base Phoenix. The Taliban attack was continuing, and she could hear radio transmissions from the base commander reporting that his defensive perimeter was shrinking. Enemy fighters were advancing from multiple directions, and his soldiers were running low on ammunition. Time was running out for everyone involved. Sarah descended toward the canyon entrance and felt her heart rate increase as the rocky walls rose up on both sides of her aircraft. The opening was barely wide enough for the A-10 wingspan, and she had to make constant small corrections to stay centered in the narrow passage. Below her, the dry riverbed wound back and forth between boulders and debris left by decades of flash floods. She dropped her altitude until her landing gear was almost touching the canyon floor. The altimeter showed numbers that would have terrified most pilots, but Sarah felt completely in control. This was exactly the kind of flying she had grown up doing, except now, instead of avoiding power lines and grain silos, she was threading her way between towering cliff faces while enemy soldiers tried to kill her. The first burst of gunfire came from somewhere above and to her right. Sarah heard the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to her cockpit, but she maintained her focus on the flight path ahead. The A-10 had been designed to absorb small arms fire, and she trusted the titanium bathtub that surrounded her to protect her from anything the enemy could throw at her from this distance. Through her targeting system, Sarah could see the Taliban positions that had been causing so much trouble for the ground troops. The enemy fighters had positioned themselves perfectly to defend against conventional air attacks, but they had never expected anyone to approach from ground level. She could see them scrambling to reposition their weapons as they realized an aircraft was flying through the bottom of their canyon. The radio crackled with excited voices from forward operating base Phoenix. The soldiers could see her A-10 flying below their position, and they could hardly believe what they were witnessing. One voice came through clearly asking how she was maintaining control at such an impossible altitude. Sarah keyed her microphone and replied that she was just following the terrain, like she had learned to do as a child. She lined up her first target and could see Taliban fighters running for cover as they realized they were about to come under attack from an angle they had never prepared to defend against. The enemy had spent hours positioning their weapons and fortifications to protect against attacks from above, but Sarah was coming at them from the side where they had no cover at all. Sarah squeezed the trigger and felt the massive Gauss-8 cannon come to life beneath her feet. The 7-barrel Gatling gun fired depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 4,000 rounds per minute, with a sound like the world's largest chainsaw. The weapon had been designed specifically to destroy tanks and armored vehicles, but it was equally effective against fortified infantry positions. Her first burst tore through the enemy position with devastating effect. The Taliban fighters, who had been confidently firing down at the American base, suddenly found themselves under attack from a weapon that could cut through solid rock. Sarah could see their carefully constructed fighting positions disintegrating under the impact of the 30mm rounds. As she flew past the first target, Sarah was already lining up on the second enemy position. The canyon continued to twist and turn ahead of her, but she had memorized every curve and knew exactly where each target was located. The Taliban fighters were now in complete panic as they realized their defensive strategy had been turned inside out by a pilot willing to fly where no one thought it was possible to fly. She fired again and watched another enemy strongpoint disappear in a cloud of dust and debris. The soldiers at Forward Operating Base Phoenix were cheering over the radio as they saw their attackers being systematically destroyed by the impossible low-flying A-10. For the first time in hours, they had hoped that they might survive the siege, but Sarah was not finished yet. Intelligence reports had identified 6 separate enemy positions, and she had only engaged 2 of them. The remaining Taliban fighters were still dangerous and could resume their attack on the base if given the chance. She needed to complete a full circuit of the canyon to eliminate all the threats before the soldiers on the ground would be safe. The problem was that the canyon was too narrow to make a conventional turning maneuver. Banking the aircraft in the traditional way would cause her wingtip to strike the rocky walls and send her crashing into the canyon floor. She needed to find a way to reverse direction while maintaining the low altitude that kept her below the enemy sight lines. Sarah remembered a technique her father had taught her for turning crop dusters in tight spaces between obstacles. It required using the aircraft momentum and control surfaces in a way that was not taught in any Air Force manual, but had been proven to work in thousands of agricultural flying operations. She had never attempted the maneuver in an A-10, but the principles were the same regardless of what aircraft she was flying. She began reducing her airspeed while simultaneously applying rudder and aileron inputs that would normally be considered dangerous or even impossible. The A-10 responded by entering what looked like a controlled slide through the air, while maintaining just enough forward momentum to keep from stalling. Sarah was essentially drifting the 30-ton aircraft around a corner like a race car driver, taking a tight turn on a dirt track. Ground troops watching from the base could not believe what they were seeing. The A-10 appeared to be flying sideways through the canyon with its wingtip missing the rocky wall by inches. The maneuver required not just flying skill but an intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that could not be learned from textbooks or simulators. Sarah was applying techniques that had been passed down through generations of agricultural pilots who had learned to fly in conditions that would challenge test pilots. As she completed the turn and lined up on the third target, Sarah felt a surge of confidence that had nothing to do with bravery or aggression. This was simply what she had been trained to do since childhood. Flying at impossible altitudes through narrow spaces while maintaining precise control was not reckless behavior for someone with her background. It was just another day at the office, except the office happened to be a combat zone in Afghanistan. The remaining Taliban positions fell quickly as Sarah methodically worked her way through the target list. Each enemy strongpoint had been positioned to defend against attacks from above, but none of them had any protection against a pilot willing to fly at ground level through terrain that seemed impassable. By the time she completed her circuit of the canyon, the siege of Forward Operating Base Phoenix was effectively over. The radio exploded with voices as soldiers at the base realized they were no longer under attack. The Taliban fighters who had not been killed or wounded in the strafing runs were retreating deeper into the mountains, where they could not threaten the strategic outpost. Sarah had accomplished in 15 minutes what 3 previous pilots had been unable to do despite multiple attempts. As she climbed out of the canyon and headed back toward base, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had proven that the mission everyone thought was impossible was actually achievable if approached with the right skills and techniques. More importantly, she had saved the lives of 50 American soldiers who would now be going home to their families instead of becoming casualties in a remote mountain valley. But her celebration was premature, because she was about to discover that the hits her aircraft had taken during the low-altitude attack had caused more damage than she initially realized. Sarah felt the first warning sign as she pulled back on the control stick to climb out of the canyon. The aircraft responded sluggishly, and she noticed a slight vibration coming from somewhere behind her left engine. During the heat of combat, she had been so focused on hitting her targets that she had not paid attention to the damage her A-10 was taking from enemy ground fire. She quickly scanned her instrument panel and saw several warning lights that had not been there when she entered the canyon. The hydraulic pressure gauge was showing lower than normal readings, and there was a caution light indicating possible damage to her flight control systems. Sarah realized that the bullets she had heard striking her aircraft during the attack run had done more harm than she initially thought, but there was no time to worry about mechanical problems because she had spotted something that changed everything. Through her targeting system, she could see a group of Taliban fighters who had been hiding in a cave system on the far side of the canyon. These were not the same enemy positions she had just destroyed. This was a completely separate group that had been waiting to launch a follow-up attack once the first assault failed. The intelligence briefing had mentioned the possibility of reserve forces, but no one had been able to locate them during the reconnaissance flights. Now Sarah could see at least 20 enemy fighters emerging from concealed positions with heavy weapons, including what appeared to be rocket-propelled grenades. If these fighters reached the American base, they could finish what the first group had started. Sarah knew she had to engage this new threat immediately, but she faced a serious problem. Her aircraft was already damaged, and she was running low on ammunition after destroying the first 6 enemy positions. More importantly, she would need to make another low-level attack run through the canyon, which would put additional stress on her already compromised flight control systems. She radioed the situation to Forward Operating Base Phoenix and received an immediate response from the base commander. He confirmed that his soldiers could see the new group of Taliban fighters moving toward their position and estimated they would be in range to attack within 10 minutes. He asked if Sarah could delay the enemy advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Sarah checked her ammunition counter and saw that she had enough 30mm rounds remaining for one more extended firing pass. The problem was getting into position to use them effectively. The new enemy positions were located on the opposite side of the canyon from her previous targets, which meant she would need to reverse course and approach from a completely different direction. Under normal circumstances, this would simply require making a wide banking turn and setting up for another attack run. But the canyon walls made a conventional turn impossible, and Sarah had already used up most of her available maneuvering space during her first pass through the narrow gorge. She would need to find a way to change direction while remaining inside the confines of the rocky passage. The solution came to her as she remembered watching her father perform what he called a hammerhead turn when crop dusting fields surrounded by tall obstacles. The maneuver required pulling the aircraft into a vertical climb, then using the momentum to pivot around and dive back down in the opposite direction. It was a technique normally reserved for aerobatic demonstrations, but it could work in combat if executed with perfect timing. Sarah began the maneuver by pulling back hard on the control stick and pointing her A-10 straight up toward the sky. The heavily loaded aircraft climbed slowly as its engines strained against gravity and the additional drag created by battle damage. She could feel the airframe shuddering as it approached the edge of a stall, but she held the climb until her airspeed indicator showed she was barely maintaining flying speed. At the critical moment, Sarah applied full rudder and used her remaining momentum to pivot the aircraft around its vertical axis. For several seconds, the A-10 hung motionless in the air like a 30-ton hummingbird before gravity took over and the nose began to drop. Sarah rolled the aircraft inverted and pulled it into a steep dive that would bring her back down into the canyon from the opposite direction. Ground controllers watching from the base could not believe what they were seeing. The A-10 appeared to be performing aerobatic maneuvers in a combat zone while taking enemy fire. One observer later described it as watching someone do a handstand on a tightrope while juggling flaming torches. The maneuver required not just exceptional flying skill but also complete trust in an aircraft that was already showing signs of serious damage. As Sarah completed the hammerhead turn and dove back into the canyon, she realized that her flight controls were becoming increasingly difficult to operate. The hydraulic system that powered her control surfaces was losing pressure, which meant she was having to use more and more physical strength to move the stick and rudder pedals. What had started as minor battle damage was becoming a serious flight emergency. But she could see the Taliban fighters clearly now, and they were closer to the American base than she had feared. Some of them were already setting up rocket launchers that could punch through the defensive barriers protecting the soldiers. Sarah had perhaps 2 minutes to neutralize this threat before the enemy would be in position to resume their attack with devastating effectiveness. She lined up her sights on the largest concentration of enemy fighters and squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 cannon roared to life once again, but this time the recoil from the massive weapon caused her damaged aircraft to yaw sharply to the left. Sarah had to fight the controls to keep her aim point steady as she walked the line of 30mm rounds across the enemy positions. The Taliban fighters scattered as the devastating fire tore through their ranks, but several of them managed to return fire with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. Sarah felt her aircraft shudder as more projectiles found their target, and she saw additional warning lights illuminate on her instrument panel. Her left engine was now showing signs of damage, and her fuel flow indicators were fluctuating wildly. She continued firing until her ammunition was exhausted, then pulled up sharply to avoid flying into the rocky canyon wall. The climb out was much more difficult this time because her control surfaces were barely responding to her inputs. Sarah had to use both hands on the control stick and all her strength to keep the aircraft flying in the right direction. As she cleared the canyon rim, Sarah looked back and could see that her second attack had been successful. The Taliban reserve force had been scattered and was no longer capable of mounting an effective assault on the American base. Several enemy fighters were visible retreating deeper into the mountains, while others appeared to be casualties from the strafing run. The radio crackled with excited voices from forward operating base. Phoenix's soldiers confirmed that the immediate threat had been eliminated. The base commander personally thanked Sarah for her actions and reported that reinforcements were now en route to secure the area. For the first time since the siege began, the soldiers felt confident they would survive to see another day. But Sarah's relief was short-lived because she was beginning to understand the full extent of her aircraft damage. The flight controls were becoming heavier with each passing minute, and she could see hydraulic fluid streaming from multiple locations on her aircraft. Black smoke was now visible from her left engine, and her fuel gauges were showing inconsistent readings that suggested possible tank damage. She tried to contact her home base on the radio, but discovered that her communications equipment had also been damaged during the low-altitude attack runs. The radio was producing only static, and she could not raise anyone on any frequency. Sarah realized she was flying a crippled aircraft with unknown damage over hostile territory with no way to communicate her situation to anyone who might be able to help. The nearest friendly airfield was still 40 minutes away, assuming her engines continued to function and her flight controls did not fail completely. Sarah began calculating her options and realized they were limited. She had enough fuel for exactly one landing attempt and no backup plan if something went wrong during the approach. As she flew toward home, Sarah reflected on what she had just accomplished. She had proven that missions everyone considered impossible were actually achievable if approached with the right combination of skill, knowledge, and determination. More importantly, she had saved the lives of American soldiers who would now return safely to their families. But her immediate concern was whether she would be able to bring her damaged aircraft home safely. The A-10 had been designed to absorb battle damage and continue flying, but she was testing those limits. Every system on the aircraft was showing signs of stress, and she could feel the airframe vibrating in ways that indicated structural damage. Sarah knew that the most challenging part of her mission was still ahead of her. She had proven she could fly lower than anyone thought possible, and could execute maneuvers that other pilots considered impossible. Now she would need to prove that she could land a heavily damaged aircraft with the same precision and skill that had made her famous throughout the squadron. The next few minutes would determine whether her incredible mission would be remembered as a triumph or a tragedy. Sarah tried the radio again, but heard only static crackling through her headset. The communications equipment had been damaged during her low-level attack runs, and she was now flying completely alone over hostile territory. No one knew her exact location or the condition of her aircraft. If something went wrong during the flight home, there would be no rescue helicopters coming to find her. She looked out at her left engine and could see that the black smoke trailing behind her aircraft was getting thicker. The engine temperature gauge was showing readings well above normal limits, and she could feel vibrations through the airframe that indicated internal damage. Sarah knew she might have to shut down the engine at any moment, but doing so would leave her flying on reduced power with a heavily loaded aircraft. The hydraulic system was failing gradually but steadily. What had started as slightly heavy controls was now becoming a serious problem that required all her physical strength to overcome. Sarah had to grip the control stick with both hands just to make small adjustments to her flight path. Her arms were already beginning to ache from the constant effort, and she still had 30 minutes of flying ahead of her. She tried to calculate how much fuel remained in her tanks, but the gauges were giving conflicting information. Some indicators showed she had plenty of fuel, while others suggested she was running dangerously low. The inconsistent readings meant that either her fuel system had been damaged or the gauges themselves were malfunctioning. Either way, she had no reliable way to know if she would make it home before running out of gas. Sarah began prioritizing her aircraft systems to determine what was essential for survival and what she could afford to lose. The navigation equipment was still functioning, which meant she could find her way back to base even without radio contact. The landing gear indicators showed green lights, but she would not know if they were accurate until she tried to extend them for landing. Her weapon systems were no longer needed, but they were adding weight that was making her fuel situation worse. The terrain below her was a mixture of mountains and desert that offered no good options for emergency landing. Even if she could find a flat piece of ground long enough for the A-10 to touch down safely, she would be stranded in territory controlled by enemy forces. The Taliban would be very interested in capturing an American pilot, and the intelligence value of an intact A-10 would be enormous. Sarah pushed those thoughts out of her mind and concentrated on flying the aircraft. Her father had taught her that worrying about things beyond her control was a waste of mental energy that could be better used solving actual problems. Right now, her job was to keep the A-10 flying long enough to reach friendly territory, where she would have options other than capture or death. The left engine temperature continued climbing, and Sarah made the difficult decision to reduce power to prevent a catastrophic failure. The engine was still producing thrust, but she could not risk pushing it too hard or it might quit completely. Flying on reduced power meant burning fuel more efficiently, but it also meant flying slower, which would extend the time needed to reach safety. As she flew over a particularly rugged section of mountains, Sarah noticed that her altitude was slowly decreasing, even though she had not changed her power settings. The aircraft was losing lift gradually, which suggested that some of her control surfaces had been damaged by enemy fire. She would need to increase power to maintain altitude, but doing so would put additional stress on her already struggling engines. The hydraulic pressure gauge dropped below the red line, and suddenly her control stick became almost impossible to move. Sarah found herself using her entire body weight to make turns and adjustments that should have required only light pressure on the controls. The backup manual reversion system was working, but it transformed the normally responsive A-10 into something that felt like flying a dump truck through thick mud. She began to understand why so many pilots considered battle damage emergencies to be more dangerous than combat itself. During the attack runs, she had been focused on hitting targets and avoiding obstacles, with adrenaline sharpening her reflexes and concentration. Now she was dealing with slowly degrading systems that required constant attention and decision-making over an extended period of time. The mountains gradually gave way to rolling hills, and then to the flat desert surrounding her home airfield. Sarah could see the base in the distance, but it looked impossibly far away given the condition of her aircraft. The left engine was now producing visible flames along with the black smoke, and she knew she would have to shut it down soon whether she wanted to or not. She reached for the engine fire suppression system and activated the extinguisher for the left engine. The flames disappeared, but the engine continued running roughly with power output, fluctuating unpredictably. Sarah decided to leave it running at minimum power rather than shutting it down completely. Every bit of thrust might be critical during her landing approach. As she got closer to base, Sarah could see aircraft on the flight line and ground crews going about their normal duties. None of them knew that she was approaching with a heavily damaged aircraft that might not be controllable during landing. The tower would normally provide guidance and assistance during an emergency approach, but her radio was still producing nothing but static. Sarah realized she would have to execute what pilots called a no-communication emergency approach. She would have to signal her intentions using standard procedures that did not require radio contact and hope that the tower controllers would understand what she needed. The approach would have to be perfect because she would only get one chance with her current fuel and hydraulic situation. She began her descent toward the airport and immediately felt how difficult it was going to be to control the aircraft during the landing phase. The manual reversion flight controls required so much physical effort that she was already exhausted from the 40-minute flight home. Landing would require precise control inputs at the exact moments when she would have the least strength available. The base was now clearly visible ahead of her, and Sarah could see that other aircraft were being cleared away from the runway. Someone had apparently noticed her smoking engine and erratic flight path and was preparing for an emergency landing. She felt a surge of relief knowing that crash crews and medical personnel would be standing by, even though she could not communicate with them directly. But her relief was short-lived, because she suddenly realized that her landing gear indicators were no longer showing green lights. The hydraulic failure had apparently affected the gear system, and she had no way to know if her landing gear would extend properly when she needed it. Landing without gear would be survivable in an A-10, but it would destroy the aircraft and could seriously injure the pilot. Sarah tried cycling the gear switch several times, but the indicators remained dark. She would have to wait until she was on final approach to find out if her landing gear would function. If the gear failed to extend, she would have only seconds to decide whether to attempt a belly landing or eject from the aircraft and let it crash in the desert. The airfield was now less than 10 miles away, and she could see emergency vehicles moving into position along the runway. Red lights were flashing, and she could see personnel in protective gear preparing for what they obviously expected to be a difficult landing. Sarah wished she could tell them exactly what problems she was experiencing, but the radio remained completely silent. She lowered her flaps and immediately felt the aircraft become even more difficult to control as the damaged hydraulic system struggled to position the control surfaces properly. The flaps extended unevenly, which created additional drag on one side of the aircraft and made it want to roll continuously in one direction. Sarah had to use constant pressure on the controls to keep the wings level. As she turned onto final approach, Sarah could see the runway clearly ahead of her, but it looked narrow and short compared to what she was used to. The manual flight controls were making it almost impossible to fly a precise approach path, and she found herself constantly correcting for altitude and airspeed variations that she could not prevent. The moment of truth was approaching, and Sarah knew that everything depended on the next few minutes. She had proven that she could fly missions other pilots considered impossible, and had saved the lives of American soldiers who were depending on her courage and skill. Now she had to prove that she could bring her wounded aircraft home safely, despite system failures that would challenge even the most experienced pilot. The runway threshold was rushing toward her, and Sarah prepared for what would either be a successful emergency landing or the end of her military flying career. Sarah crossed the runway threshold at exactly the right altitude and airspeed, but she could feel the A-10 wanting to drop out of the sky like a stone. The damaged flight controls were making it almost impossible to maintain the precise glide path needed for a safe landing. Every small correction required enormous physical effort, and her arms were shaking from exhaustion. After fighting the heavy controls for over an hour, the landing gear indicators were still dark, and she had no way to know if her wheels were down and locked. Sarah made the decision to continue with the landing, rather than attempting a go-around that might be impossible with her current fuel and engine situation. If the gear was not extended, she would find out in the next few seconds when 30 tons of aircraft met the concrete runway. Ground crews watching from the control tower could see that her approach was unstable and that black smoke was still trailing from her left engine. The A-10 appeared to be wallowing through the air like a wounded bird struggling to stay airborne. Emergency vehicles were positioned along both sides of the runway with firefighters and medical personnel ready to respond the moment her aircraft touched down. Sarah felt the first contact with the runway as her main landing. Gear hit the concrete with a jarring impact that told her the wheels were indeed extended and functioning. The relief she felt lasted only a split second, before she realized that her aircraft was bouncing back into the air instead of staying on the ground. The damaged flight controls had made it impossible to execute the smooth touchdown that the A-10 normally required. The aircraft bounced once and then slammed back onto the runway with even greater force. Sarah could hear metal groaning and felt the entire airframe shudder as the landing gear absorbed an impact far beyond what it had been designed to handle. Warning lights flashed across her instrument panel as various systems registered the punishment her aircraft was taking. With her wheels finally on the ground, Sarah faced the next challenge of actually stopping the heavily damaged aircraft before running out of runway. Her normal wheel brakes were not responding properly due to hydraulic system failures, and she could feel that she was not slowing down as quickly as she needed to. The end of the runway was approaching fast, and she still had dangerous amounts of speed and momentum. Sarah deployed her drag chute, which normally would provide significant additional stopping power. But even this backup system was not working correctly because of battle damage to the chute deployment mechanism. The parachute opened partially but then began to tear and flutter ineffectively behind her aircraft. She was going to have to find other ways to stop before running off the end of the runway and into the desert beyond. She tried differential braking on the wheels that were still working and used reverse thrust from her right engine to create additional drag. The left engine was too damaged to provide reliable reverse thrust, but she attempted it anyway, hoping to squeeze every bit of stopping power from her crippled aircraft. Gradually, she could feel her speed decreasing, but she was still moving much faster than was safe. The crash. Crews were racing alongside her aircraft now with foam trucks and ambulances keeping pace as she rolled down the runway. Sarah could see their flashing lights through her side windows and knew that everyone was prepared for the worst-case scenario. She was determined not to give them any more excitement than they had already experienced. With less than 200 yards of runway remaining, Sarah managed to bring her aircraft to a complete stop. Smoke was pouring from her brakes and landing gear, but the A-10 was intact and she was uninjured. She sat in the cockpit for several seconds trying to process what she had just accomplished, and letting her heart rate return to something approaching normal. Ground crew swarmed around her aircraft. As soon as it stopped moving, firefighters sprayed foam on her smoking brakes while maintenance personnel began assessing the extensive battle damage. Sarah could see dozens of bullet holes in her wings and fuselage along with larger tears where shrapnel had penetrated the aircraft skin. It was a miracle that any of her critical systems had continued functioning. The crew chief appeared at her cockpit window and gave her a thumbs-up signal to ask if she was okay. Sarah nodded and began the process of shutting down her engines and securing her systems. The left engine was making horrible grinding noises, and she could see that several turbine blades were missing from the intake. The engine had apparently been running on borrowed time for most of her flight home. As she climbed out of the cockpit, Sarah felt her legs wobble from the combination of adrenaline crash and physical exhaustion. The crew chief steadied her and asked if she needed medical attention. Sarah shook her head and said she was fine, but she appreciated the concern. What she really needed was a few minutes to sit down and let her body recover from the most challenging flight of her career. Major Williams appeared at her side within minutes of her landing. His face showed a mixture of relief and amazement as he looked at her battle-damaged aircraft. He told Sarah that the entire squadron had been monitoring radio frequencies, trying to establish contact with her during her flight home. When she failed to respond to repeated calls, everyone had feared the worst. Williams walked around the A-10 examining the extensive damage while shaking his head in disbelief. He counted more than 50 bullet holes in the airframe along with tears from rocket-propelled grenade fragments. The hydraulic system had been completely destroyed, and the left engine would need to be replaced before the aircraft could fly again. He told Sarah that most pilots would not have been able to bring such a heavily damaged aircraft home safely. The base commander arrived and personally thanked Sarah for her successful mission. He had already received reports from Forward Operating Base Phoenix confirming that her attacks had completely eliminated the Taliban threat and saved the lives of all 50 soldiers at the outpost. The enemy forces had retreated deep into the mountains and showed no signs of returning to threaten the strategic position. Sarah listened to the praise and congratulations, but her mind was already moving beyond the immediate aftermath of her mission. She had proven that techniques learned crop dusting could be applied successfully in combat situations that other pilots considered impossible. More importantly, she had demonstrated that gender had nothing to do with the ability to fly dangerous. missions and make life or death decisions under extreme pressure. News of her mission spread quickly through the airbase and then to higher command levels. Within hours, Sarah was receiving messages from generals and politicians congratulating her on what many were calling the most impressive display of low-level flying in Air Force history. The video footage taken by ground troops at Forward Operating Base Phoenix was being analyzed by tactical experts who could hardly believe what they were seeing. But Sarah was most proud of a simple message she received from the base commander at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. He told her that every soldier under his command had volunteered to write personal thank you letters to the pilot who had saved their lives. They wanted her to know that her courage and skill had given 50 families the chance to welcome their loved ones home safely. The other pilots in her squadron were looking at her differently now. The skepticism and doubt that had followed her throughout her career had been replaced by genuine respect and admiration. Captain Morrison, who had been her harshest critic, was among the first to congratulate her and admit that he had been wrong about female combat pilots. He said her mission had changed. His mind about what was possible when skill and determination were more important than physical strength. As Sarah walked back to her quarters that evening, she reflected on how much had changed in a single day. She had started the morning as a pilot who was constantly having to prove herself to colleagues who questioned her abilities. She was ending it as someone who had redefined what the entire Air Force considered possible in terms of low-altitude flying and close air support tactics. The mission had been successful beyond anyone's expectations, but Sarah knew that the real victory was not just saving the soldiers at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. She had proven that excellence in flying had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with skill training and the willingness to push beyond conventional limitations. That lesson would benefit not just her own career but every female pilot who followed in her footsteps. Tomorrow there would be debriefings and reports, and probably more missions that would test her abilities in different ways. But tonight Sarah could rest knowing that she had faced the ultimate test of her flying skills and had proven that the doubters had been wrong about everything that really mattered. 3 weeks after her impossible mission, Sarah found herself standing in a conference room at the Pentagon surrounded by generals and tactical experts who were still trying to understand exactly what she had accomplished. The video footage from Forward Operating Base Phoenix had been analyzed frame by frame by the Air Force best pilots and engineers. Everyone agreed that what they were seeing should not have been possible with existing aircraft and training methods. General Patterson, who commanded all A-10 operations worldwide, had flown to personally debrief Sarah about her techniques. He was a pilot with over 30 years of experience who had seen every kind of flying imaginable, but even he was amazed by the low-altitude maneuvers she had performed in combat conditions. He told Sarah that her mission had fundamentally changed how the Air Force would approach close air support in difficult terrain. The Nebraska role that Sarah had improvised during her turn in the canyon was now being studied by test pilots at Edwards Air Force Base. Initial attempts to duplicate the maneuver in controlled conditions had been only partially successful because most pilots lacked the intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that came from years of crop dusting experience. The Air Force was developing new training programs to teach similar techniques to other pilots. Sarah explained that the maneuver was not really anything new or revolutionary. Crop dusting pilots had been using similar techniques for decades to turn aircraft in tight spaces between obstacles. The difference was that most military pilots had never been exposed to agricultural flying methods that emphasized low-altitude maneuvering over high-speed performance. She suggested that the Air Force might benefit from recruiting more pilots with farming backgrounds. The tactical implications of her mission were being discussed at the highest levels of military command. Sarah had proven that aircraft could operate effectively at altitudes that everyone had previously considered impossible. This opened up new possibilities for attacking enemy positions that were protected from conventional airstrikes. Several classified programs were already being developed to explore these new capabilities. But Sarah was more interested in the human impact of her mission than the tactical innovations it had inspired. The 50 soldiers from Forward Operating Base Phoenix had kept their promise to write personal thank you letters, and each one had arrived with stories about families and dreams that would have been lost if the Taliban attack had succeeded. Reading those letters reminded her why she had become a pilot in the first place. Sergeant Martinez had written about his daughter's first steps that he would have missed if he had not made it home. Corporal Johnson described his plan to propose to his girlfriend when he returned from deployment. Private Williams thanked Sarah for giving him the chance to attend his brother's college graduation. Each letter represented a life that had been saved by her willingness to fly lower than anyone thought possible. The formal recognition came in the form of the Distinguished Flying Cross, which was presented by the Secretary of the Air Force in a ceremony attended by her entire squadron. Sarah stood at attention as the citation was read, describing her heroic actions in saving American lives through exceptional flying skill and courage under fire. The medal was important, but the real reward was seeing the pride on her parents' faces as they watched from the front row. Her father had flown from Nebraska to attend the YO ceremony, and Sarah could see tears in his eyes as the secretary pinned the medal to her uniform. After the formal proceedings, he told her that he had always known she would accomplish great things, but even he had not imagined anything like this. The crop dusting techniques he had taught her as a child had literally saved lives on the other side of the world. The media attention that followed the ceremony was overwhelming. Sarah found herself being interviewed by reporters who wanted to know about the barriers she had faced as a female pilot, and how it felt to prove the doubters wrong. She tried to keep the focus on the mission and the soldiers she had saved rather than on gender issues, but the symbolism of her achievement was impossible to ignore. Young girls from across the country began writing letters to Sarah telling her that she had inspired them to consider careers in aviation. Parents sent pictures of their daughters playing with toy airplanes and talking about becoming pilots like Major Chen. Sarah realized that her mission had impact far beyond the immediate military consequences, and that she had become a role model for an entire generation. The other pilots in her squadron treated her completely differently now. The skepticism and condescension that had followed her throughout her career had been replaced by genuine respect and admiration. Captain Morrison, who had been her harshest critic, became one of her strongest supporters and publicly admitted that he had been wrong about female combat pilots. He said Sarah had taught him that excellence in flying had nothing to do with gender. Flight training programs across the Air Force began incorporating lessons learned from Sarah's mission. The emphasis on minimum safe altitudes was replaced with more flexible guidelines that recognized the importance of terrain and tactical situation. Instructors began teaching students that conventional limitations were often more psychological than physical, and that skilled pilots could safely operate in conditions that appeared impossible to others. Sarah was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of her own squadron 6 months after her mission. The promotion made her one of the youngest female squadron commanders in Air Force history and sent a clear message that the service was serious about recognizing talent regardless of gender. Her new unit specialized in developing advanced close air support tactics that built on the techniques she had pioneered. The impact of her mission extended beyond the Air Force to other branches of the military. Army helicopter pilots began studying her low-altitude flying techniques to improve their own capabilities in dangerous terrain. Navy pilots incorporated elements of her approach into their training for operations near mountainous coastlines. Even civilian aviation organizations began examining how crop dusting methods could be applied to search and rescue missions. 2 years after her mission, Sarah received a phone call that meant more to her than all the medals and promotions combined. The caller was Sergeant Martinez's daughter, who was now old enough to talk on the phone. The little girl wanted to thank the lady pilot who had helped bring her daddy home safely. She said she was going to be a pilot too when she grew up, so she could help other people the way Sarah had helped her family. Sarah retired from active duty after 20 years of service, but continued working as a civilian instructor at the Air Force Academy. She developed courses on unconventional flying techniques and tactical innovation that became required training for all future pilots. Her emphasis on thinking beyond traditional limitations and adapting civilian skills to military missions influenced an entire generation of aviators. The dry riverbed approach that Sarah had used became standard doctrine for close air support missions in mountainous terrain. Dozens of similar missions were flown successfully using her techniques, and many more American lives were saved as a result. The tactical manual that documented her methods was classified for several years, but eventually became required reading at military academies worldwide. Forward Operating Base Phoenix was renamed Camp Chen in her honor, and a memorial was erected celebrating her mission. The inscription read that sometimes the most important battles are won not through strength or aggression, but through skill and the willingness to attempt what others believe impossible. Visitors to the memorial could see the exact canyon where she had flown at impossible altitudes to save 50 American soldiers. When young pilots asked Sarah about her famous mission, she always gave them the same advice her father had given her years earlier. She told them that the closer you fly to the ground, the more you can see what really needs to be done. She emphasized that conventional limitations often exist only in people's minds, and that excellence comes from pushing beyond what others think is possible. Sarah's legacy lived on in every pilot who refused to accept that something was impossible simply because it had never been done before. Her mission proved that the most important qualities in a combat pilot were not physical strength or aggressive personality, but rather skill training and the courage to innovate when lives were at stake. She had shown that angels could indeed fly at any altitude when the mission required it. The final entry in her official Air Force record summarized her career impact in simple terms. It stated that Major Sarah Chen had redefined what was possible in military aviation through exceptional skill and determination. More importantly, she had inspired countless others to look beyond traditional limitations and to remember that the ultimate measure of a pilot was not how high they could fly, but how effectively they could help those who needed it most.